I'm talking now with Emily Van Schenkhof, who we're going to be talking about the legislative priorities for 2016 in Missouri for Missouri Kids First. Emily, thanks for your time today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. You always make it so pleasant, Mike. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We've talked about a couple of these issues in a way last year with the last legislative session, but you're going to be building on a couple of things. Let's start with a couple of those. And one of those, you're going to be pushing for an issue dealing with access to evidence-based mental health services for certain children. Tell me a little bit about that, and how does it relate to what you did last year?
So I always think that the work that we do in our child welfare system is always constantly evolving, and we're always trying to get better. So it's very unusual for us to work on something really out of the blue. We're always building on what we did last legislative session. So you build a foundation and you build on it and you build on it and you build on it, because it takes a lot of time and slow iterative change to be able to build systems that are the most functional for addressing a very complex issue such as childhood trauma and abuse and neglect of children. If this was an easy task to do, then we would have figured out how to do it a long time ago. And so we're always constantly building on what we've done before and thinking about how we can do it better and different. But one of, I would say, our top priority at Missouri Kids First and for the child advocacy centers in Missouri is to dramatically expand access to evidence-based mental health services for children who have been abused and neglected. We recognize and know that children who have experienced trauma, that those results, if those left untreated, will manifest themselves throughout a child's lifetime. And so really working with the child to help them heal from what has happened to them can affect our society in such a positive way. Children who have experienced trauma have higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of stroke, higher rates of suicide. They statistically die younger than people who haven't experienced trauma. And so we really believe that it not only affects the child and how they feel for the rest of their life, but it also affects their health for the rest of their life. And there's, of course, so much cost associated with that. And, of course, in the General Assembly, we're always talking about costs. What are our costs to our state? And there's tremendous cost to our state with the unresolved trauma. And so we really want our state to get a lot better at providing appropriate mental health services to children who've experienced trauma. And when I mean appropriate, I mean evidence-based services. I mean services that they have done studies that show that children who undergo this type of treatment model have lower PTSD scores than children that don't. We, for a long time, have done mental health treatment with children in a way that certainly I'm not suggesting that anybody has done anything intentional, but just kind of the way that the systems sort of naturally evolved it hasn't been in a way that really meets the needs of children. And so we want to see more children access throughout our state to evidence-based treatments. And I will say that there is a lot going on in our cities, Kansas City, St. Louis, and our metropolitan areas. There are some people doing some amazing work in evidence-based mental health treatment for services. But when we look throughout the state, there are places where there is no access to any type of treatment, let alone an evidence-based model. And so we really need to push so that we can try to increase that access in some of our more rural communities where there isn't access, and then the services that are provided aren't as quality as we know that children deserve and need. So I will say that this is probably one of our legislative priorities that might be the most, I would say we are not likely to have a significant bill or appropriations related to this. We got funding in last year's budget for $500,000 to establish a network of mental health providers who are trained in evidence-based practices, and we're going to be, with that money, providing learning collaboratives all throughout the state and the evidence-based models that we know work. So we're going to be trying to maintain that funding. Anytime you get a new line item in the budget, it is always subject to people wanting to cut it, thinking it's not necessary, having to really justify, of course, and we should, why this funding should continue. So that we're going to focus on that. But I also think that that the solutions to these problems are very complex. One of the things I would like to see our state do within a few years is create a code in Medicaid where we're paying providers an adequate rate for providing these services, because they are more complicated. They do have a lot of upfront costs associated with them. And right now we disincentivize the use of these practices that work. So I think that that's probably too ambitious for next session. We're not far enough in our planning to be able to ask for an enhancement to a Medicaid billing code, to be able to create a new billing code for this. But I would like to build the kind of infrastructure for this where, at a time when we kind of do have more of the bugs and kinks worked out with this, where people at the General Assembly already really understand what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about access to evidence-based mental health services, but it might not, but at the end of the day, there might not be a bill or a policy associated with it. But I'm going to start lots and lots of conversations and every opportunity that I can to say that we need to do a better job of serving the mental health needs of traumatized children. And so that might be really what that looks like this year, guarding the appropriation and starting a conversation. It might not be something super concrete at this point.
And when we're using this term a lot, evidence-based, what exactly, that seems maybe self-explanatory, but what exactly do we mean by that?
So when, actually the terminology is interesting. So in scientific communities, the words they really use are empirically supported, or so that there are empirical studies, peer-reviewed studies that have been done by researchers where you have randomized controlled trials with certain scientific methodologies have been met that show that if you receive this type of treatment, there is a reduction in usually what I'm interested in is post-traumatic stress, PTSD type of symptoms. And but I actually find empirically supported to be a word that's not as used as much kind of in the general public. And so I use evidence-based. And so really, it really just means is that there is a solid scientific base showing that when you perform a particular type of intervention, you typically get, I mean, it's never 100%. It's not like a vaccination or inoculation when you're talking about a therapeutic model. But at a population level, they've done studies on these models that show that if you put a child into parent-child interaction therapy, the vast majority of kids will have a reduction in health consequences and in behavioral manifestations. So really, it's just kind of a word that shows that there's evidence and science behind it. And there's actually kind of clearinghouses at the federal level, at the that designate these programs, and you have to kind of go through a process typically to be called evidence-based or empirically supported. And the models that we're really promoting are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and parent-child interaction therapy, the two most widely adopted models for working with the population that I'm interested in, abused and neglected children.
All right. Well, there was another bill that was that you and I spoke about several times last year, and that did pass. And this dealt with children who themselves have problem sexual behavior. Tell me a little bit about that bill, and then what you're doing to move beyond what happened earlier. I should say this year, the 2015.
Yeah. Well, that was really exciting. So one of the things that we worked on last year was to give Children's Division the authority to provide family assessments in cases of youth with problem sexual behaviors. What we were seeing is that our system had two different types of responses to children that were being sexually abused. We had one response for children that were being abused by an adult, and we had another system for kids that were being abused by other children. Nationally, the research really shows that about 25% of sexual abuse is perpetrated on children by other juveniles, by other older juveniles. And so we were seeing a lot of cases in this state where children were being molested by a 12-year-old. They were being molested by a 10-year-old. And there was no, Children's Division did not have the authority to provide services to those families in any really structured way because the statute really says that Children's Division can only provide services and only investigate cases where the person who's created the alleged perpetrator has care, custody, and control. So it's that definition of care, custody, and control meant that in large part, we had no system response to a child that was a 6-year-old that was being molested by a 12-year-old. And so we essentially gave Children's Division the authority to provide family assessments in these cases. And our Children's Division has two different types of cases that they do. And one are investigations that are more typical of going in and trying to figure out whether or not a crime occurred or whether or not abuse occurred. And then they also have another process called the family assessment process where they go in and try to assist and help families. And I guess this is a part of Children's Division that we don't hear about a lot, but it's a lot of what we want our Children's Division to do, is to come in into families and to say, okay, something not right has gone on here. We've gotten a hotline call, but how can we help you? We want to help families that want to change, that don't want things to happen. We want to offer them opportunities to change. Not everyone who gets hotlined is someone that can't safely have a relationship with their child. Some of them absolutely can't, but some of them, many of them can. And so we chose a family assessment process for this because we did not want investigations where we were coming in and putting 11-year-olds on the family registry. We did not want this to be a punitive approach. We wanted it to be an approach that said, this is a child, this is an 11-year-old, this is a 12-year-old. This is not someone who's fully formed. We want them to have an opportunity to not go down this path. And so even though this behavior, which is wrong, it is destructive, it is harmful, we want to redirect these behaviors and offer an opportunity to change. So it was a very ambitious bill. It's a very substantial change to what we investigated as a state. And so on April 28th, a call that wouldn't have been accepted by our Children's Division hotline on August 27th, on August 28th, these were calls that now workers were going out and investigating. And we saw in the first few months a tremendous number of calls coming in and a tremendous number of assessments that were occurring throughout the state. And I think the volume really shocked us. I don't have the latest data on it, although I did ask them for that, and so I hope to have that fairly soon. But in the first 2 months, they did over 850 assessments. So immediately we saw that there were people calling in and that this was occurring, and there was a lot of need for what we did. Problem being, of course, that the General Assembly did allocate $200,000 to allow the division to hire 5 additional staff members to take this caseload, but honestly, those workers had a full caseload within a week or two. And so we have been running into some problems with Children's Division, already an agency that these workers have high caseloads. This is a tough job, one of the toughest jobs there are out there, and where they did not have the capacity to meet the volume of calls that came in for this. And so I have been concerned about it. I mean, I will be candid, I have been very concerned about how this is going. I do know, and this is troubling to hear, but it's the reality of public policy work, is that we had to take workers, experienced workers, off of child fatalities, off of really very serious cases, and transition them over to providing these family assessments, because these family assessments, because nobody's done it before, are also really hard cases. So we need really good workers doing this, especially at the beginning, people that have a lot of experience, to kind of learn how to do this. But it was concerning to hear that it put a burden on other workers, on us already stressed system, where we were taking workers, the most experienced workers, and moving them from investigating very serious cases of child abuse and moving them to these family assessments. And I don't know if there's any way around that. No public policy is seamless. Nothing happens perfectly when you try to move a giant system. And so I just really think we're in a position now as a state that we have to meet the need and the demand so that they can perform the duty that we have asked them to perform.
Are you alarmed at the number of assessments that we're talking about? Just more than 850 of this new type of assessment in and of itself, but then you're obviously talking about a big workload in these other types of assessments outside of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there is such volume in our Children's Division. There are, I believe over 100,000 hotline calls a year. These folks are working hard. So we do know this is a system that needs more help than what they have right now. We have historically not invested the amount of resources we need in our state system to be able to investigate these cases, and now we've asked them to do something additional. And so a big piece of what we're going to work on this year as a part of our legislative agenda is asking for an increased appropriation so that the Children's Division can have the staffing that they need in order to be able to perform these family assessments and in order to be able to continue to do the other extremely important work they do. I just fully believe that as tough as our budget climate is, maintaining and working as hard as we can to protect our children, the bodily integrity, the psychological integrity of our children doesn't have a price. Although, of course, capital culture, everything has a price. But I believe it is something that we can do and that we are obligated to do for our children.
Have you started having that discussion with any lawmakers yet?
No, No, I am nervous about it. I think that I have been so thrilled by the response that we've had in the last few years, a real willingness to understand there is a role for government, that if something means something, if it's a priority, you have to invest in it. I have really been so thrilled by how much people have worked hard to find resources to be able to serve children. But it's always hard to ask for money in a time when you don't have a lot of money, and there are so many competing interests that it's always a challenge, and it makes me nervous because the consequences of not doing it are fairly serious. You know, they are, when we have kids that are being abused, and we have a worker that has a caseload of 45, you know, there are going to be balls dropped in there. And when I talk about a ball drop, what I mean is a child is really hurt or a child dies. And so the consequences of failing to invest in our child welfare system mean children die or children are hurt. And so it does make me very nervous because I know that the stakes are really high for the kids in our state. And I also know that, you know, I can't fill the halls of the Capitol with little kids that are abused. And they don't call legislators and say, I'm being hurt. They go to school and they act out. They sit and endure because children cannot talk about what happens to them in the same way that adults do. And they are entirely dependent on their caregivers for meeting their needs and protecting them. 80% of child abuse is perpetrated by caregivers of children, by parents. And so these are the folks, so children face tremendous barriers in talking about what happened to them and asking for what they need. So I know that the constituency I represent is not a powerful constituency in Jefferson City. And so it always makes me very anxious to go in and ask for what they need, knowing the environment that I'm operating in, where there's lots of people asking for lots of things, most of which there is absolutely a need for. I take it very seriously because I know I have to, and I always believe that all I can do is ask for what is needed, and at the end of the day, other people make that decision, and I can only control what I do. And so I'm gonna work really, really darn hard, and I have to be comfortable with that. But yeah, I mean, you know me, Mike. I do get anxious about this, and I do know that it's a lot to ask of our General Assembly.
But let's spin off of that just a moment, because I know that you also feel very strongly about how the last couple of sessions have gone, and some, as you would call them, positive things that have come out of the last couple of sessions, and the reception, as you mentioned earlier, that you get right now from some of the lawmakers that you're talking to.
So I really have been, I started working at Missouri Kids First. This will be my 5th legislative session. And when I first walked into the building, I had no idea what to expect. I did not know how receptive people would be to this. And I have been sort of blown away by people's willingness to have hard conversations about the needs of our children, people's willingness to go to that place that oftentimes people don't want to go to hear about children in need, to hear about a lot of what I do is really unpleasant. And most of the time I feel like people don't really want to go there. It doesn't feel good to talk about child sexual abuse. It doesn't feel good to talk and to realize that this is operating. And it's sort of human nature to move ourselves out of hard conversations that don't feel good. But I have really been so amazed by people's willingness to have conversations about it, to hear about the pain that our children experience, to acknowledge that our system isn't good enough. And so we have gotten a lot of good things done. We did see a historic increase in funding for Children's Division 2 years ago, with an additional $6 million invested in trying to improve our child welfare system. We have an extremely strong director of Missouri's Children's Division, and I believe that the General Assembly feels that they are getting a good investment and they trust the person who is making these decisions. Of course, there's always tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch, but I feel like in the area of child welfare, we've tried to minimize that tension and say we're all kind of on the same team working to try to make our system better. We also had revisions to our criminal code that included some of the strongest enhancements that we've seen on child sex crimes, a real willingness, again, to talk about child sex crimes, to not think of this as a subject that we don't want to go to because it's not pleasant. When we worked on the criminal code, we went through that bill with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that it did not affect children in any adverse way, and everybody wanted to make sure that was done. And again, then finally, with what we did last year with our youth with problem sexual behaviors, people weren't saying we don't want to help these kids. I think people understood, yeah, we're not going to treat a 12-year-old the same way we would treat a 32-year-old man. They're completely different. And so people's willingness to have hard conversations about that really blew me away. And so I guess, I mean, I think, I'm a pretty positive person. I believe that there is incredible beauty in human beings, and they are capable of incredible good. Unfortunately, human beings are also capable of great evil, and I also see that. But I always just try to focus on the good that is in people, and I have seen that at the Capitol, which is so inspiring to me. I've seen people willing to make an investment in children and have hard conversations and not think of this as an afterthought, or as, there are so many important issues, but people are willing to make this an important issue. So I do feel like there is a lot of opportunity there to continue to make really meaningful changes for children. And there are people in leadership positions that say this matters. So I'm always optimistic, but cautiously optimistic, because you never know what will come in that building, and you can never get confident, and you can never get to a place where I should never be comfortable in this position, because it's just the nature of the business is that the Capitol changes, especially with term limits, and you just never know what each session is going to bring. Obviously, we saw that last session, and despite it being a very good session for Missouri's children and for Missouri Kids First, it was a tough session for everybody who worked in that building, and definitely teaches you that that nothing is guaranteed. But I am optimistic.
Do you have an idea how much you're talking about, how many more investigators might be needed, how much money you might be talking about in a potential appropriation?
Really right now, as I'm still developing those cost estimates, because we do believe we saw an uptick right at the beginning when the law went into effect. I want to make sure that my cost estimate isn't too high. And so I'm still at the point where I'm talking to the division about how many reports they have. And so I do anticipate that it will be probably a number in the $1 million range, but it could be a little less. I want to make sure that it is based on the most recent data. And so I'm kind of waiting on them to get that final data to say, and then honestly, I'm probably going to modify it. I'm probably going to make a decision January 1. And then we might continue to have to modify it because this is such an evolving thing. So what I'm going to try to do every single month is get a sense of how many calls we've gotten, have they declined, where is the division at with staffing, and so it's going to have to be fluid. But I do think it will be not insubstantial. It certainly will be something that is $1 million is not outside the scope of possibilities, but it's also not something that everybody's going to be like, great, yay, sure, easy, no problem.
All right. The last priority you and I discussed before we got rolling here is dealing with confidentiality protections for forensic interviews with children of sexual abuse. Tell me what the concern is there with those interviews.
So just for a little context for anybody who's watching, because I don't think I really knew what a forensic interview was until I started working in the child welfare field. But forensic interviews are neutral fact-finding interviews that we do with victims of child sexual abuse. They are essentially a forensic interviewer sits with the child in a small room, and the members of the multidisciplinary team usually sit on the other side of the wall through a two-way mirror. And we have to ask questions to the child in neutral ways that aren't leading, so that and then we use the recordings of these as evidence in investigations, both civil and criminal. And so when I say forensic interview, that is a term that sounds very kind of generic. What a forensic interview, though, truly is a child's most shameful and embarrassing and horrific story. They are horrific stories of abuse. And anyone who's ever seen a forensic interview, they change your life when you see them. To see a 7-year-old talking about anal rape, and the juxtaposition typically of a very young child talking about things that talking about sexual things is horrific. The first interview that I ever saw, I wanted to throw up. It was so horrific. And I've seen now several of them, and they are, each of them, extremely disturbing. You watch a child's face as they talk about how it felt when their uncle did something to them. And by did something, I'm euphemizing that. And so they are extremely graphic. And so what we have unfortunately found is that when we record these interviews in child advocacy centers, we typically, the members of our multidisciplinary team have to have access to that. They have to see that DVD in order to be able for the children's division worker to make, to figure out what happened to that child, in order for the prosecutor to be able to take that into court so that the jury can see it. But what we've run into is that people are being pretty casual about what they do with these DVDs. And so we will, and by people, where we typically run into problems is with defense attorneys. And so sometimes you will make a copy of a forensic interview in a criminal proceeding, and the defense attorney gets a copy of it because they are entitled to see any piece of evidence that the prosecution is going to enter. But what you'll have is anything that's in the defense attorney's file is technically the defendant's. So that means that defendant gets to do whatever they want with that DVD if they'd like. We also, because of the nature of the work that we do, these are sometimes high conflict families. And so another place that we run into trouble is with a child custody and divorce proceedings. So a parent's attorney in a civil proceeding will request a copy of a forensic interview for a child custody hearing, for a dissolution, to say that basically, so we end up getting a lot of subpoenas for child advocacy centers, get subpoenas for these copies of these DVDs. And sometimes parents' attorneys aren't very careful about what they do with these DVDs. And so there was a case in Indiana where a child's forensic interview got uploaded to YouTube. Because again, you got a DVD that now that information is easily translatable or easily transferable. And sorry, my phone is ringing over here. So unfortunately, so we've seen those cases of it being uploaded on YouTube and other places. I've seen just this year alone, a defense attorney gave a mock trial team at a university in the state, gave a child's forensic interview to the mock trial team at a university. So a group of students got to have a copy of this child's evidence, this child's story. We have had cases where, unfortunately, just a month ago, where a member of the MDT gave out a copy of this to a parent's attorney, and they gave it to the alleged perpetrator. So an alleged perpetrator was given a copy of a forensic interview during an active criminal and civil investigation. Those children, in that particular case, I guarantee you, were hurt because they disclosed sexual abuse on the part of the mom's boyfriend. We have had other cases where we've had lawyers just hand the forensic interview over to somebody that they know in the courtroom. We've had forensic interviews ended up on courthouse parking lots because people aren't being careful enough with these. And so our bill would essentially put into place that unless you're a member of the MDT team, you cannot get a copy of the forensic interview unless you go through a court proceeding. And then the court puts protective conditions in place, which says to you that you cannot copy that. You cannot distribute it. You cannot show it at a family reunion. You cannot use it to terrorize the child. So yes, so defense attorney, if you want access to it, you can come to the prosecutor's office and you can watch it in the prosecutor's office, the same way you do with the bloody t-shirt. You don't hand a copy of the bloody t-shirt over to the defense, but you allow them access to it. Or if they really need a copy of it, they can come to court and they can and they can explain to the judge why they need a copy of it. And then the judge says, okay, that's fine. You have a good reason why you need a copy of it. But then you can't distribute it, you can't give it out, and you have to give it back. So just essentially saying, if you want a copy, if you want the convenience of a copy, you have to, under court order, you have to be careful with what you do with it. Otherwise, you can view it, you can watch it, people can have access, people who need it can have access to these things, but they aren't entitled to a copy of it. Problem a little bit is that our criminal justice system likes the convenience of how they handle it right now. So it is convenient for parents' attorneys, it's convenient for defense attorneys to say, hey, can I have a copy of that? But there's harm to children that occurs when we're casual about this. And we've seen too many cases where people are not taking these forensic interviews as seriously as they should. I think that if adults had forensic interviews done of them and there were copies of them going in and out everywhere, we would not, if it was my story, if it was your story, if it was your child's story or my child's story, I would only be comfortable with the people that absolutely need to have access to it, having access to it. And right now, our criminal justice system is pretty loosey-goosey about what they do with these things. And I guess I feel like, as somebody who advocates on behalf of children, if I'm going to ask kids to come in and tell their stories, I should be working really hard to make sure that people who don't need that story don't get it. What happens if someone who's a public official at some point decides that a public official who's a victim of child sexual abuse decides someday that they want to run for office? Does that mean we're going to see forensic interviews rolling across the CNN screen? These interviews and digital information is so easy to transmit these days. And so we need to realize that if we're not careful about this, if we don't get ahead of this, we are going to have pictures of, we're going to have forensic interviews on YouTube in Missouri. We're going to be further terrorizing children with our criminal justice system. So we're going to work really hard on this bill to try to figure out a way to protect this information. And so I'm hopeful that we can do it, but this is complex legal matters. There's due process issues involved. There's judicial discretion involved in here. Our criminal justice system likes the way they do business now. These are systems that have been set up for a long time, and they're set up for the convenience of the members of the criminal justice system. And so oftentimes I do see people not wanting to make changes because we all like how we do business. And but I am going to ask, and we're asking, that our criminal justice system find a way to accommodate the needs of sexual abuse victims, and that the convenience of attorneys does not supersede the a child's interest to privacy. And sometimes in the legislative environment, there are costs and benefits to every single piece of legislation, but I think we need to realize that there are significant costs associated with how we do business right now.
Your relationships that you built during the rewrite of the criminal code in the last few years, do you think that those will help you in that conversation?
Absolutely. So Senator Dixon is going to be our sponsor in the Senate. He's Senate Judiciary Chairman. We worked hand in hand with him on the criminal code revision. The folks that we work with know that we work really hard for the best interest of children, and that we try very hard to be fair. We are members of the multidisciplinary team. We care very much about the efficiency of our criminal justice system. We care very much about due process. I think we do have credibility. We don't propose ideas that are half-baked. We negotiate with anyone who wants to negotiate with us. We always think about unintended consequences. So I do believe that we have a reputation for being fair and for trying to do business the right way, and being interested in feedback to our bills. I never become wedded to my language. It's not about language. It's about solving a problem. So if somebody wants to do it in a little bit different way, I'm always open to that. And Senator Dixon knows that. And so he is very helpful to us in the Senate. And then Marcia Hafner on the House side is our sponsor, and couldn't find somebody who cares more about working hard for kids. And then just the folks that are over on the Judiciary Committees on the House side also really understand that we're doing this for the right reasons. And so people want to help us get there. But I will say it's going to be complicated. It's going to be hard. We don't want to we can't adversely affect due process. And I believe that those challenges absolutely can be negotiated.
Well, Yvonne Schenkhof with Missouri Kids First. It is some heady stuff that we have to talk about, but I appreciate your time with that today. And I know we'll be talking more as we get into the session here before we know it, frankly. But thank you for the time today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, and it always just means so much to me, Mike, that you decide that these issues are worth talking about and covering, and that Missouri Net believes that the work that we do is newsworthy. I believe it's newsworthy. I believe it's as newsworthy as anything that happens in that building is how we're protecting children. But if you didn't believe that, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. So thank you.
You're welcome. We're glad to do it. Thank you, Emily.